So the title for this seminar is When Does Human Life Begin? And this question is often ignored, but must be considered to be fundamental for both healthcare issues and human value. The answer to the question is, in one way, very simple and obvious to most of us who are educated in medical sciences. A new life is at hand at the moment of conception, or when the conception is completed. When the sperm and the egg fuse and a totally new life is started with a unique combination of DNA which will last for the rest of the life. And if the germ cells are of human nature, the conception is the beginning of a human life. But if that was all there is to it, this question, when human life begins, would hardly be the subject for any seminar or debate at all. And we know that is certainly not the case. By several reasons, this fundamental question has turned out to be complicated and very controversial. The main reason for that is, of course, the issue of abortion, and more lately also in vitro fertilization and possibilities to explore and to diagnose the unborn. Thus, also when we share the view that the human zygote represents human life, we may have different opinions whether this very early human life is also a human being with a full human value. That is the reason why the question, easily answered at a first glance, may be considered as far more complex and intricate. Thus, we are excited to hear Professor John Wyatt's thoughts and experience in this field. So please, John.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you for this privilege to be able to participate in this conference. And I'm just going to start my screen now. Okay, so you're getting a sneak preview. When does human life begin? As you've heard, I have a particular take on this topic because of my experience as a neonatologist. I worked for many years in neonatology in central London and as a researcher. So my experience has been for many years caring for tiny and extremely vulnerable babies going right down to the limits of viability. 22 weeks, 23 weeks. The youngest baby I ever cared for who survived was 21 weeks and 6 days. And as you know, it's relatively routine now for babies at 23 weeks to survive. And many of them of these babies are doing extraordinarily well, although there is a significant incidence of brain injury, which remains one of my main research interests. But what this teaches us is something of the extraordinary fragility and wonder of a tiny life. That's actually my hand and one of the babies on the baby unit. And inevitably, although I went into neonatology because primarily because I love children and because it was a fascinating and rapidly advancing area of medical science, I realized that I was in the midst of a huge ethical challenges, an ethical maelstrom. And it's really because of that experience that I became more and more fascinated by the questions of medical ethics and by how to respond to them from the position of a Christian believer. And one of the interesting things that I now see time and time again is that as science advances, science and technology advances, it raises the question, what does it mean to be human? And although that is an age-old question, which has, of course, been around for millennia, as science advances, it raises the question with new urgency and with a new perspective. And so the question that we're looking at today, when does human life begin? Or as I'll say, when is there a person? This is not a new question. But science has taught us, of course, something that the ancients were never able to know. And so here's an electron micrograph of a sperm fusing or entering with an egg. There is the blastocyst passing down the fallopian tube and then entering the uterus, and implantation occurring into the wall of the uterus. There is a 4-week post-fertilization embryo, 6 weeks, and so on. And the title and the way that most people frame this question is, when does human life begin? But as Thomas has already said, in some sense, we know the answer to that. We know that the being in the womb is human, and we know that it's alive. And why is it alive, this being in the womb? Well, because the mother was alive. And why is the mother alive? Well, because her mother was alive, and so on and so on and so on. So in fact, when we ask the question, when does human life begin? One answer to that is to go all the way back to the dawn of humanity itself. That's when human life begins, and human life is simply passed on in reproduction. So the question is not, I think, primarily a biological question. And so I would like to reframe it in this: when is there a person whom I have a duty to protect? And immediately we reframe the question like that, we realize that that's not primarily a scientific question. It's a question to do with philosophy and theology. What is a person? How do I recognize a person? And it's a question to do with morality and ethics. Do I have a duty of protection to this being? And it's interesting that in the book of Ecclesiastes, the question of the development of the embryo in the womb is regarded as one of the ultimate mysteries of the universe. And so the writer of Ecclesiastes says, as you do not know the path of the wind or how the body is formed in a mother's womb, so you cannot understand the work of God, the maker of all things. In other words, human development and formation in the womb is one of the ultimate mysteries, and one of the ultimate mysteries of God's work himself. But of course, we know far more than the ancients. And the question is, how do we build a bridge between the biblical and Christian understanding of what it means to be an unborn child with our modern scientific understanding of the process of human reproduction? And I want to say straight away that there's no simple answer to this question. And of course, Christians who are committed to be faithful to Christ and are committed to read the Bible and follow its teaching have come to different conclusions on this question. So I think we have to recognize the fact that Christians probably will continue to be divided about this question. And therefore, I think the aim is not to reach consensus, but the aim is for each of us in ourselves to come to a position which we believe has credibility and which we can, in all conscience, hold. And just very briefly, I'm going to go back to a very well-known passage, Psalm 139, and just very briefly bring out what we can learn from this about God's involvement with the unborn child. And I'm going to speak just very briefly under 3 headings: creation, covenant, and continuity. I have to admit that I pinched this framework from John Stott, who was a spiritual father to me, and he uses it in his book, Issues Facing Christians Today. So first of all, creation. So the Psalm 139 is clear throughout. The emphasis is on God's personal creation of the being in the womb. The unborn baby is lovingly called into existence as a unique person by a personal creator. And in the literal Hebrew of verse 14, it says, I praise you because I am awesomely wonderful, wonderful your works. Or to paraphrase, I praise you because I am wonderful. And you know, every human being can say that. Every human being can say, because of God's creation, I am wonderful. And as somebody who's cared for some children with very profound congenital malformations, lethal abnormalities, chromosomal abnormalities, and so on, I can still say that every one of those babies, however profoundly affected by malformation, can still say, I praise you because I am wonderful. And actually, we are called to say that to others. And it's interesting that the whole emphasis of the psalmist seems to run counter to our modern understanding of reproductive biology. So what reproductive biology emphasizes is both randomness. So for instance, which sperm will happen to enter the egg is entirely random, and which egg it happens to be released at a monthly cycle is random. So there is complete and uncontrollable randomness in the process of the sperm meeting the egg. But then also, once the mitosis has occurred, the fusion of the embryos, and then the mitotic process, then mitosis is entirely mechanical. 1 cell click, 2 cells click, 4 cells click, 8 cells click, and so on. It's an entirely mechanical process. What's fascinating is that the view of the psalmist is entirely different from that. What the psalmist says, implies in Psalm 139, is that our being is not haphazard due to chance, and it's not automatic or mechanical due to inflexible laws. It is intentional and it is personal. So God chooses intentionally and personally to bring an individual into the world. Second, there is the language of covenant. So Bible scholars say that there are particular words in Hebrew which have a profound significance, which is often lost in our modern translations. And the language of Psalm 139 in Hebrew is the language of covenant. So right from the beginning, David the psalmist says, God, you know me. You are familiar with all my ways. You have laid your hand on me. You saw me. This language is the language of covenant, that God has covenanted himself to love and care for this individual in the womb. And notice also that it's a unilateral covenant. It's not that David says, I knew you were loving me, God. I reached out to you in the womb. No, the being in the womb had no knowledge of God, no awareness of God, but God knew and was involved and was in covenant relationship with David, even in the womb, even when he was unaware. It was a unilateral covenant of grace. And then finally, the language that is used is the language of continuity. In other words, David doesn't say there was that blob in the womb, that strange thing, and eventually it turned into me. No, he emphasizes the continuity between himself, the adult human, and the being in the womb. That was me that you formed in the womb. You saw my body. That was me that you wove together in the hidden place. And so the emphasis throughout Scripture is on the continuity of the life course, that it's one person known and loved by God, both from before the womb, before the birth, through the life, and on into the new heavens and the new earth. So I come back to my question, when is there a person that we have a duty to protect? And I think we must hold together two biblical and theological themes when we think about this. First of all, we hold together the already and the not yet. In other words, the embryo is already something, some being, but it is not yet what it is going to be. And one way of expressing that is that the embryo is in the process of becoming what it already is. It is becoming a human being. It already is a human being. It's on the journey. And if you think about it that way, that of course that's true for us too. As adult human beings, we haven't arrived on our journey. We are still on the journey. We are still in the process of becoming what we already are. And our process of development and becoming will carry on all the way through until finally we meet God face to face. So in one sense, there's not that much difference between a human embryo and an adult human like us. It's just a difference of degree. We are further along the stage, but both of us are in the process of becoming what we already are. And then second, we hold together the physical and the immaterial. And this is a theme that we find time and time again in biblical theology. So, for instance, we say that the Bible is just words written by men, but at the same time, it is the living word of God, breathed by the Spirit. We hold together the physical and the immaterial. And in the same way, I think we should think about the embryo in this way. The embryo is just a bundle of cellular machinery. It's just developing 2 cells, click, 4 cells, click, 8 cells, click, 16 cells. But at the same time, something immaterial is happening. A unique and irreplaceable person is coming into existence, and who God knows and loves, and who is destined for eternity. And when you ask yourself, how is it possible for these two processes to be going on simultaneously, for the physical, mechanical process of mitosis, and then at the same time this mysterious thing of a new, unique, eternal person coming into existence? And the answer is, I don't know, but they're both true, and we must hold them together. But I think there's something else which is really important, and that is in the way that Scripture teaches us, and in the very nature of our biology, what we see is that making love, sexual intercourse, and making babies belong together. It's not an accident. It's a kind of strange biological freak that the most intimate and profound physical way we have of expressing love for another human being is also the way that we make babies. That's not just some kind of biological fluke accident. That's all part of the design. That's the way God made it to be. And therefore, the danger with reproductive technology is that it seems to separate, or it can separate, particularly if we go in for gamete donation, embryo donation, sperm donation, egg donation, surrogate pregnancy. We're breaking the link between making love and making babies. So I often show this slide when I'm speaking to medical students on this topic. And I say, look, here on the left, this is what you looked like when you were born. This is what you look like at 28 weeks. This is what you look like at 18 weeks over here on the right. Bottom left, this is what you look like at 6 weeks. This is what you look like at 3 weeks. This is what you look like at 3 days. That's exactly what you look like. And so as you trace your own personal history, as you think of yourself going back into the womb, that was you at each of those stages of development, is there any point at which we can confidently say, no, that's not me, that's just a blob. That's just a structure. And interestingly, I don't think there is. However far I go back in my personal history, even to the few cells embryo, I cannot say that is not me, because I know that if that embryo had failed to implant, or if it had been flushed down the waste pipe, then I wouldn't be here giving this lecture. So however far I go back into my human origins, there's no point at which I can reliably say that is not me. And yet we do know that a very significant number of embryos that are created during normal human reproduction and created following intercourse a very significant number of those embryos fail to implant and are lost. And current estimates are that only about a third of embryos that are developed actually implant in the uterus. In other words, 2/3 are lost. And of the ones that implant, another, at least a third probably, are lost by early miscarriage. So we know that there's a very large loss of embryos in the process of normal human reproduction. It turns out that the majority of the embryos that are lost have got major chromosomal abnormalities, sometimes hugely aberrant genetic structures, but which are completely incompatible with life. But nonetheless, I think these are facts that we need to wrestle with to try to understand the kind of knowledge which we have, which David and the psalmists and the biblical writers didn't. But I come back to this idea, therefore, that we don't discover the personhood of the fetus through science alone, because human personhood is something much more profound than that. How do we know there's a person there? Answer, we reach out to them with love. That's how you discover a person, by reaching out to the other with love. And I came across a nice illustration of this on the internet. This is a transvaginal ultrasound, very, very early ultrasound, and the little blob with the calipers on is 5 millimeters. So just imagine, in your fingers, look at what 5 millimeters look like, half a centimeter. And yet, what love says is, we're expecting a baby. That's not a blob, that's our baby's first photo. So do you see the point? The point is that it's love that sees the person, as opposed to the biology. And so it seems to me that we're called to reach out with love to these beings in the womb, in the hope that their personhood is going to be revealed to us. But of course, we cannot think Christianly about the being in the womb without coming to terms with the most utterly bizarre and weird aspect of Christian theology. I think we are so familiar with the Christmas story that we have lost how utterly bizarre, unexpected, ridiculous the story is. And in fact, in the ancient world, this was the major sticking point for most of the Greek and Roman philosophers who were confronted with Christianity. They could just about believe that the God, the creator of the universe, might appear as some kind of avatar, as some kind of human image. But Christians were claiming that the God of the universe turned himself into a physical fetus, into a baby who vomited and squitted down his mother's back and had a pain in his tummy, and who fed on her breast. And to the Greek philosophers, this was utterly bizarre and unacceptable, crude and unsophisticated and clearly ridiculous. And yet, that's what Christians claim, that God turned himself into a fetus. And as one theologian put it, God in the person of Jesus has experienced every phase of human existence. He was with us in the darkness of the womb, as he will be with us in the darkness of the tomb. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? You didn't know you existed when you were in your mother's womb, but the Lord Jesus was with you as a fellow fetus in some ways. He too had been a fetus, and he was with you in the darkness of the womb, as he will be with you in the darkness of the tomb, because he's experienced that too. There's nothing we can go through in our human experience which Jesus himself hasn't shared with us in some sense. But I've always loved this little homely incident which Luke, the physician, places in his gospel. you could ask the question, why does Luke want to have a story of two pregnant women gossiping together? Why does he want to put that into his gospel? I'm sure I wouldn't have put that little anecdote into his gospel. He's got much more weighty things to put into his gospel. But Luke, when he heard the stories, and he probably went and, interviewed Mary and he interviewed Elizabeth and he wrote it all down in his notebook. And he said, this story is so amazing, I've got to put it in my gospel. And you know the story. Mary has just had the news from the angel. She takes a deep breath and she says, I am the bond slave of the Lord. Let it be unto me as you have said. In other words, she gives her consent. I say yes. And then very shortly afterwards, she decides to go and visit her cousin Elizabeth, who lives some way away. And as she travels and is running into the room, she's calling Elizabeth's name to give her the amazing news. And Elizabeth is filled with the Holy Spirit. And she says, blessed are you, Mary, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why should it be that the mother of my Lord, notice that, the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leapt for joy. So we can roughly work out where these people are. I mean, Luke clearly is saying, from the outside, there are just two people in this room. There's Mary and there's Elizabeth. But actually, what Luke says is there are four people in this room. There's Mary and Elizabeth, and there's the unborn John the Baptist, and there's the unborn Jesus. And John the Baptist is leaping for joy at the presence of Jesus in the same way that the lame man is going to leap for joy as Jesus walks by later in the gospel. So where is John the Baptist? Well, he's about here. You can actually work out from the text. He's about 7 months gestation. So in the middle and the top, this is John the Baptist. You can see he's leaping for joy. Okay, so where is Jesus? Well, the answer is Jesus is probably about here. He's about 3 weeks gestation. He's no more than 1 or 2 millimeters. And yet, Elizabeth, filled with the Holy Spirit, says, the mother of my Lord. This is my Lord. And he's 1 or 2 millimeters wrong. And so the question is, how does this illuminate our understanding of these beings in the womb? Does it change as we think, because, as I sometimes say, because Jesus was a fetus, all fetuses are special. Because Jesus was a dying man, all dying people are special. So how does our understanding that God himself has invaded the womb in the person of Jesus, how does that influence our thinking? I'm coming to the end, but I just very briefly want to say that also our language matters. It's fascinating, as we think about the being in the womb, there is no neutral language. You can talk about a human embryo. Embryo is the noun, human is the adjective. In this case, of course, the point is there are lots of embryos. There are chimpanzee embryos, there are sheep embryos, there are fruit fly embryos, and there are human embryos. And you know what? They all look the same. They're just embryos. So what's the big excitement about the human embryo? Of course, that's the way that embryologists often say. They can't understand why Christians and other people get so excited. It's just a cell. It's just got a nucleus and a cytoplasm and so on. But if you change the language round, you can talk about an embryonic human. There are adult humans, and there are pediatric humans, and there are infantile humans, and there are fetal humans, and there are embryonic humans. And you know what? They're all human beings. They're all on the journey. So do you see how even the language we use changes the way we understand? There is no neutral language. And so how does this understanding of the human embryo alter our attitude? So if I just say what my own personal view is, my own personal view is that there is no, as I go back, there is no point at which I can say there is not a person there. And therefore I feel my duty as a Christian is to try to protect that being in the womb, even though I know that many of those beings fail to implant and fail to grow into humanity. That does not give me, I believe, the right to willingly destroy a human embryo because I don't know if there's a person there. And one of the questions is, how do we respond to the uncertainty of not knowing? But I recognize that other Christian believers have come to different positions. Some of them believe that it's appropriate to destroy an embryo that isn't implanted, but that once it's implanted, that we should protect it. And some of them would say that it would be appropriate to destroy a being after it's implanted, but before significant bodily development takes place. So there are different positions, and I certainly would not want to claim that my own understanding is the only one that's compatible with Christian thinking. But just to point out that, of course, the attitude we take to the early human or the embryonic human or human embryo certainly will influence our thinking about mechanisms of contraception, in vitro fertilization, genetic pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, embryo freezing, three-parent embryos, and genetic modification of embryos. So certainly the view we take of the embryo will have very significant implications for the views we take about reproductive technology. I just, in the last 2 minutes, I just want to sidestep and say something that I feel passionately about. Because I think that so often when Christians talk about abortion, they talk about it in very negative terms. They say, you know, abortion is wrong, it's evil, it's bad, we mustn't do it, it's a stain against God, etc., etc. But it seems to me whenever we say that something is wrong, we must immediately say, and here is a better way. And I've had the privilege over the decades of seeing a practical Christian responses to the problem of abortion here in the UK. And I think it's so persuasive and so powerful. I would just love for Christians around the world to be doing the same kind of thing. And it is the development of so-called Christian crisis pregnancy centers, which are led and run mainly by women, for other women, reaching out for them, showing compassion and care. We have an independent shop front in central London, and we provide a safe and non-judgmental place. We provide accurate information. We discuss the options of people who have a crisis pregnancy. We support them. We also provide post-abortion support for people who are traumatized because of a previous abortion. We provide befriending for those who continue the pregnancy, often unsupported single women. We provide practical support with clothing and equipment, and we provide a community mums group. And I think this represents a kind of practical, positive way of demonstrating the value of the unborn life and demonstrating that the interests of the mother and the interests of the unborn child are not in opposition. That is the fallacy which so often pro-choice campaigners say. You either choose the mother or you choose the baby. The reality is what's good for the mother is good for the baby. What's good for the baby is good for the mother. The interests of the mother and the interests of the baby are combined, and therefore we care for both. We show practical compassion and support for both. And that seems to me a wonderful Christian option. And I close with this. Love is a way of saying to a person, it's good that you exist. It's good that you're in the world. If you're interested in these topics, there are a lot of free resources available at johnwyatt.com, and these are the books that are also available. Thanks so much. I'll finish there.
Very much, John. I imagine that I'm not the only person here who got something to think about here, and there are certainly a lot of questions. And since John has to leave 12:20 Swedish time, we will have just a quarter of an hour now to discuss in groups, and there is a group for the Zoom participants as well, and we can form a few groups here to discuss some impressions from this beautiful speech. And I thank you very much John. It was amazing, and I hope that this discussion will end up with some questions. And we have got 5 questions from John, suggestions on things that we can talk about. So we will come back to that later. But first, I think we will have just a quarter to discuss here, and then we can come back to John with questions. So if you form groups now and discuss and formulate questions that you will address to John after a quarter. So please do so.
You know, we have to acknowledge that there are many issues over the years. Just take the issue about war and pacifism. You know, Christians have been deeply, deeply divided about an issue which has been utterly, you know, is a matter of life and death. What happens when armed conflict breaks out? How do Christians respond? So you know, we could give many other examples. So I don't think we should be that surprised that there are differences about such a fundamental issue. What we need then to ask ourselves is, how do we respond in a Christian way to the fact there are differences? And I think that we must agree to differ in a Christian way, and that means with respect. But also, you know, I think that doesn't mean that we shouldn't seek to persuade one another, as long as we do it gently and with respect, and also recognize that people change their views. I mean, I changed my view. When I was a medical student, there was a whole number of Christians in gynecology and who were actually quite positive about abortion as a Christian response, particularly where there were very tragic social circumstances. And as a medical student, I was very influenced by them, and I followed their beliefs. And the idea basically was that the unborn child was not a full human person until, actually, some people argued, till the very first breath of life after delivery. And as I learnt more and studied the Bible more and talked to other people, my views changed. And, you know, I came to a quite different position about the need to respect life right to the very earliest form. But that took me several years. So I think we're all on a journey. And I don't think we should be surprised or alarmed that there are differences between us. What's most important is that we learn to differ in a Christian way and in a respectful way, whilst together seeking to learn more, you know, seeking to be open to new thoughts, new information, new wisdom.
Thank you for that answer. I think my personal experience is similar, and I think that knowledge is a key here, that lectures like yours today or similar lectures to people who are not very aware of these issues at all may enlighten for some the complexity. And I have seen people radically change their minds when they get the proper knowledge, the proper information about it. So I think, but on the other hand, society's standpoint here is very influential, of course, and society has changed during the last 20, 25 or 40 years in this issue. And today it's very difficult to discuss this question because it is so established that abortion is a right for the woman. It looks a little bit different in different countries. In Sweden, we have the oldest abortion legislation in the Western world. It hasn't changed almost anything since 1974. In other countries, they have been a little bit more adopting to the knowledge and the possibilities to save fetuses very early. So I think the message should be that try to increase your own knowledge and to enlighten others.
And Thomas, could I just add something here? Because I think it's very important to realize that, in fact, the modern secular world is deeply confused and contested on this issue. Mm-hmm. Because what I see all the time in the antenatal ultrasound clinic, it is remarkable because the first thing you need to ask the mother is this a wanted fetus or not? If it's a wanted fetus, then the ultrasonographer or the ultrasonologist or the gynecologist, they say, oh, look, there's his nose, there's his hand, he's waving at you. Oh, he's got his father's chin. Yeah, oh, he's very busy today. You know, all the language is about baby, it's about joy, it's about recognition, it's about identity. And of course, every baby has a photo album. And when I was early started as a pediatrician, the photo album started with a photograph taken after birth. But now every baby's photo album starts with a grainy ultrasound scan, sometimes at 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And the parents will say, that's you, that's when we saw you. So, and yet, if it turns out that the fetus is unwanted and the mother is here for a termination, all of a sudden the language changes and the professional will say, oh, the pregnancy is about 12 weeks gestation and it seems to be normally formed. And the language is completely neutral and objective. And yet the being in the womb is exactly the same. Yeah. So I don't think we should think, oh, well, the secular world has really, come to a very logical place in this. Like, they haven't at all. They're deeply, deeply contested about how to respond to this being in the womb.
Yeah. Yeah, someone here, I want to put a question. You're welcome. Step forward.
Hello. My group's question would be, how do you talk to your students about those list of issues like assisted reproduction, IVF, and pre-implantative genetic examination and so?
Thank you. Yes, I had a very interesting position because my responsibility was to teach medical ethics and to medical students and postgraduate medical ethics, and yet I was employed by an entirely atheistic university. University College London was one of the first completely atheistic universities set up in opposition to the religious foundations of other universities. So I had to develop a way of being able to talk with integrity about these issues without at the same time completely losing my job. But I think one of the most important things to communicate to students and to our colleagues is that there is no neutral position. Everybody is coming from somewhere. And the idea that science and rationality can give you a completely neutral position, an objective position, is entirely false. No serious philosopher these days would defend the idea that there is such a thing as a completely neutral scientific position. And so often ethics professionals, bioethicists, they give the impression that their position is entirely objective and neutral, whereas these Christians, they have their weird beliefs and commitments and faith and all that stuff. But actually, it isn't like that. Everybody is coming from somewhere. And everybody has the right to say where I'm coming from. So the way I used to teach it is I would say, well, here are two views of the embryo. Here are two views of the fetus. They're both very ancient views. They both can be traced back hundreds of years. It's an ancient argument which is still going on today. And if you believe A, then you will believe B, C, D, and E. But if you believe Z, then you will believe, and so on. And then I say to the students, in the end, you have to pay your money and make your choice. Each of us will be forced in our clinical career to come to some decisions about how we regard the fetus and about our own involvement in procedures such as abortion and reproductive technology and so on. And what we need to do is make those decisions on an informed basis.
Hello. As you said, tradition from older times are in the fetus, in the embryo. But when the fetus is alive, the next generation is also planned because it's a girl or it's a boy. And the girl has the oven. How do you say eggs? No, the eggs. The girls are different from the boys. So the plan forward is already there. And thank you, John, for everything.
Yeah, no, thank you indeed. And of course, that is a very important point. I mean, that's an extraordinary point, isn't it? That in the ovum, in the ovaries, at a very early stage are the eggs, which will lead to the future generation. And so again, it is it does show the extraordinary wonder of what it means to be human. And I think, the danger is for us as professionals that this is just our ordinary working process, And I remember when our first son we had our first antenatal appointment, and I went with my wife, and it was at our hospital at UCH, and we did the ultrasound scan, and I saw for the first time my son, and it was an extraordinary moment, and I had tears in my eyes, and I was absolutely emotional. And I went down to the neonatal unit with my colleagues, and I came in and I was on a kind of cloud, and I said, "I've just seen my new son," and the attitude was, "Big deal," and because I think we can so easily, as professionals, lose the sense of wonder of what it means to be human. So I think it is important for us to hold on to the wonder at the same time that we practice our science as clinicians.
Thank you. We have a question from the participants on Zoom.
Yes, we have. Sorry, now you moved it. Lawrence. Here is a question from Kersti Nordpol. Do you want to speak for yourself, or shall I read what you asked? I think you can speak. Kersti, are you with us? Okay, I'll ask the question then. She writes, "Thanks for the great seminary, Dr. Wyatt. I would like to ask what consequences the view of human life you so beautifully are drawing up here can have for our use of contraception. I mean, the various technologies you mention, gamete donation, embryo donation, etc., are relatively rare in comparison to all the fertile women using various contraceptive methods." That was the question.
Yeah, thanks. And of course, thank you for the question. And I agree with you that at one level, contraception is a very important issue. But having said that, I don't want to diminish the importance of these other technological things, because they also are huge issues which we are facing as a human race. The interesting thing about contraception is that there has been surprisingly little detailed research into the mechanisms of existing contraception. And the reason for this is that there is no commercial interest. I mean, or scientific interest for that matter. I mean, why would you spend millions of dollars investigating the precise mechanism by which an intrauterine device works, doing incredibly detailed studies, in animals, in chimpanzees, or in other mammalian species, and then doing detailed studies of pregnant women in order to work out precisely how often an IUD causes failure of implantation, and how often it causes failure of ovulation, and how often it causes a mechanical barrier to the sperm meeting the egg, and so on. And And the answer is those studies, my understanding is that by and large, those studies have not been done to any kind greater detail. And therefore, we simply don't know the details of how many of the contraceptives we use actually operate. And the same is true for some of the hormonal treatments, like hormonal implantation. How often, if you were to take 1,000 women and they were all to have hormonal implants, how many times would there be breakthrough ovulation, and how many times would that sometimes affect implantation? And it turns out it's all precisely to do with what the time of the month you are, and also the levels, the hormonal levels. When you put the implant in, are very high, and then over the next weeks the hormonal levels gradually go down, and that changes the risks and all the rest. So interestingly, I think the conclusion is that we cannot be very dogmatic about how contraceptives work, and therefore there's always going to be a degree of uncertainty. But certainly, if you were to take the position that I would hold, I would be in favor of either mechanical techniques, which prevent the sperm from meeting the egg, or hormonal techniques, which prevent ovulation. And I would be more concerned about techniques whose primary method is by preventing implantation. But it's important just to think a little more about this, because something I have reflected on many times is that the Christian understanding of the human body, of course, is that this is reflects part of God's wonderful design. It isn't just an evolutionary accident, the way the human body is constructed. God, I believe in evolution, but I believe that God supervised and directed the process of evolution in order to his process, for his design to be revealed. And the same applies, for instance, to the baby Jesus. So if we think about human design, the fascinating thing is that when the ovum meets the egg, and conception, fertilization takes place, the mother is utterly unaware of that reality. There is no way she can know whether there is a fertilized ovum present. It's not until implantation takes place that the hormonal changes start, the pregnancy test goes positive, and some women say they can actually feel that they're pregnant. But that only happens after implantation. And I can't help reflecting that maybe God in his providence designed it so that we would never know whether there was an ovum there. Because think of two people who are Christians and who want to protect the embryo, and they are having regular unprotected intercourse. They would never know whether actually there was a fertilized ovum was present. And therefore, the possibility was that if the mother was to go off skiing, or to or long distance running, or to drink too much wine, she might actually lead to the death of the fertilized egg. So surely, much better, because of the risk of killing a baby, she shouldn't do any of those things. And there would also be this terrible guilt that at any moment she was going to cause the death of her child. So isn't it interesting that actually, in order to prevent that happening, God doesn't allow us to know whether or not there's an embryo there or not. It's like it's below the radar screen. Until implantation takes place, we are unaware of whether there's an embryo there. And that makes me think that is the morality of the unimplanted embryo is different. We don't have the same duties to an unimplanted embryo as we do to an implanted embryo. There seems to be some difference there because it's below the radar screen. Now, again, these are deep mysteries. But so in other words, I suppose my conclusion is I'm not an absolutist when it comes to contraception. I'm not saying this kind of contraception is good, this kind of contraception is evil. I don't think we can say that. I think we can say this kind of contraception might be better. This kind of contraception, if you can avoid it, might be it might be better to avoid it. But I don't believe that we can be very dogmatic about that, and say confidently that something is good or something is bad.
Thank you so much for your answer, John. And I'm sorry I wasn't there to ask in person, but thank you to the facilitator for asking my question out loudly. And I think you gave a very thorough answer, and you certainly gave me some new pointers. I was aware of the fact that there is absolutely, compared to how many people are using contraception, there is so little research on the actual working mechanisms. But these were some good pointers for thoughts, what you said, following up. So thank you so much. And also I want to thank you for just following up the human, the view of the human. It's so consequent in the Bible from the very beginning. Like you said, some things are under the radar, but it's very clear that the potential for human life is something that the Bible values highly, and you did it by valuing the Bible highly in your teaching here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. God bless you.
Okay, are there any more questions in the audience or on the chat? Then meanwhile, I will ask a question, because here in Sweden we have a great debate about whether you can avoid participating in some actions in healthcare because of a conscience. So the freedom of conscience has been under debate. We have a few midwives here in Sweden who have become well known to most people because they have refused to participate in abortions, and then they have been fired from their jobs or prevented to get a job as a midwife, even though abortion is not the only thing, thank God, that midwives are doing. So what is your view on that, and how is it in UK?
Yeah, thanks very much. I'd love to give a whole other talk about the conscience, because it is, I think, something that's really important and absolutely fundamental to following Christ. But unfortunately, I haven't time. Perhaps you're relieved. Can I just say that just last week, I recorded a webinar on the subject, and which is available on the ICMDA website. So I don't know if the local organisers could just find that and give the link for those who would like to follow further. But just very briefly, different nations have very different traditions, and this is a huge difference between the Anglo-Saxon tradition that I come from and the Scandinavian tradition, because I've had the privilege of visiting Scandinavia many times, and I've always been struck by the differences. There are many things about Scandinavian culture which I respect, and which, to be honest, is much better than Anglo-Saxon culture. But one of the things about the Scandinavian culture is it puts much more emphasis on the community and on community solidarity, and it frowns down on individuals who stand out and who are different. And so there is a huge pressure in the Scandinavian culture, as I understand it, to conform, to keep your head down. Do not be different. Don't stand up, because you will be subject to huge social pressure. Interestingly, in our Anglo-Saxon culture, it is quite different. We have always celebrated the individualists who stand up against the tide and who say, I'm right and you're all wrong, and I'm going to go this way, and whether you like it or not. And this is part of our British culture, and of course it's in the American culture as well. And therefore we fight for the right of conscience. For us, it is much more significant because it's within our culture. But I think, to be honest, this is one aspect where Anglo-Saxon culture has probably got it more right than Scandinavian culture. All cultures have good things and not so good things. And, conscience is an absolutely central part of following Christ. And when the state forces you by state power to do something that you believe is wrong, that is a violation. And the phrase that I use, which is a shocking phrase, but I think it's a useful phrase, is it is a rape of the heart. And I think you should use that phrase because that's exactly what it is. When the state forces me by state power to do something which I believe is wrong, it's a rape, it's a violation. It's not just a trivial thing. It's something of real significance. And so I would want to say, yes, conscience is important, but we need to come together and argue the case. Why is it important? So in my webinar, I give 3 fundamental reasons why conscience is important. First of all, it's important because for my own personal moral integrity. Second, it's important for the way that the medical profession is viewed as having as acting in patients' best interests. And third, it's important because ultimately it's either state power or the right of the individual. And what the Nuremberg trial and the Nazis told us is that you can't say, well, the state made me do it. The Nuremberg trials after the Second World War said the Nazi physicians were responsible for their own actions, whatever the state told them to do. In other words, I have to be responsible for my actions. I cannot allow the state to force me to do what I believe is wrong.
Thank you very much. I recognize that time is out and you have to leave. And we thank you so much, John, for participating here and giving this beautiful lecture. And we wish you all luck and bless you.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really apologize I have to go, but thank you.